All right, so in this video, we're going to start unit 4, which is going to be on heredity. This video is going to be starting off by talking just about what is the purpose of meiosis and why it's related to genetic variants. So a lot of people get this misconception that it's just mitosis twice. It is most definitely not. There's a much larger picture in terms of why things would have to do meiosis. So before we get things going, I need to at least kind of introduce what are these couple of key terms that you should know. If we say that something is heredity, that word, if it's a heritable trait, that means you're going to be passing traits from one generation to the next. Okay. Now, a couple things about these traits. They're basically small segments of a gene, right? So if we had, let me do a quick little double helix here, right? And if you forgot the definition of a gene, it's just a section of DNA. Like if this one small section, that would be a gene, and that would get expressed. Okay, so if we say it's a heritable trait, you want to know that it is actually a gene that gets expressed, and you can pass that down. Okay. If it's a trait that you have and you are not able to pass it down, think of like if you dyed your hair, you've changed your phenotype in a weird way, but that's not a heritable trait. You're not necessarily going to be passing it down. Same thing if, you know, like you lost, let's say, unfortunately, like if you lost a limb, you no longer would have a hand or an arm or whatever you lost, but it doesn't mean it's a heritable trait. So just understand if we talk about a heritable trait, it is in the DNA and that can get passed down through meiosis. Now, things that are going to be heritable traits are going to be phenotypes, but also realistically what your AP test will do is they'll probably throw out some weird thing like an enzyme. Okay, give you some weird name about an enzyme and you're like, I don't know. Well, you got to remember all the enzymes that make you a human, that make you actually live and breathe, an enzyme in respiration, even a protein that you wouldn't even know about, they could choose that as a heritable trait. Okay, now when we get into this, we got to introduce variation. So those are going to be differences within a population. And that kind of goes without saying that there is variance, but there also has to be variance within a gene. So this will kind of be a nice introduction of like what's dominant versus recessive. If you are, let's say, a really large tomato or a relatively small tomato, there's going to be a lot of similarities, but there's also going to be some differences, and that kind of leads into genetics. Genetics is studying these heritable traits and variation. Okay, so the key about this chapter is you kind of need to have this in the back of your mind is how is it increased? So you really want to make sure that you understand and can answer these questions about, okay, well, first and foremost, what is meiosis? But secondly, you got to understand, well, how does that increase variance within a population? And furthermore, why does that matter? So this is just showing you different types of tomatoes. There could be some type of selective advantage in terms of what you really should be fixated on. But for the most part, there is going to be genetic variances within all of these, okay? If I looked at their genome sequencing, there's going to be a lot of similarities, but there's also going to be a few differences, okay? Just don't forget the molecular side of this, because I bet that that's going to be where their focus is going to be. Because oftentimes they like to mix in topics together. So heredity is passing of traits. Again, the passing of traits are going to be genes. What's a gene? It's not the entire chromosome. It's a small section of that DNA that actually gets expressed. So that's a nice overview. So we think about heredity in terms of inheritance, right? This is talking about genes. It's a segment of DNA, okay? So like I just mentioned in the previous slide, it's that small, tiny section. And furthermore, gametes are going to be where meiosis occurs, okay? All right, so understanding that, if you are passing down a trait, that trait has to be actually within your gametes where you're doing meiosis, okay? Now this is showing you some stock photo of a family, but again, you got to understand a lot of things are going to be doing meiosis. So when you think about what's the point of meiosis, it's all about sexual reproduction. So before we do that, it's a good time to kind of revisit what's asexual and what is sexual reproduction. So if something is doing asexual reproduction, that means you're always going to have a genetically identical species to the parent. Okay, so no variance is occurring. So couple of things about asexual reproduction. There's a couple of different types, but if we refer to it as binary fission, basically it recopies itself. Those are going to be typically done in prokaryotes. I shouldn't say typically, it's always done in these bacterial cells or prokaryotic cells. They just replicate their DNA and then they split, and then it's all of a sudden going to create a whole new cell, okay? So this is showing you a hydra. Hydras are kind of weird. They actually do both, but basically it's showing that this one stem can actually bud off and then you get a whole new offspring. So that would be an example. But the key thing about if it's asexual, assuming no mutations are happening, there's going to be no variance, no variation at all, because you're just copying the DNA exactly. Now, in sexual reproduction, basically you have two parental cells. They create similar offspring. Now, again, similar in the sense that they're going to be the same species. They're going to have a lot of the same genes, but it's going to be a unique combination of genes. Some genes that you inherit from the mother are going to be dominant. Some genes from the mother are going to be recessive, and vice versa for the dad. Some of the dad's genes or the male genes are going to be dominant. Some are going to be recessive. But the point is to increase variation. Okay. Now, I know evolution is not on your AP test this year, but the point of variation, I should kind of put this out here now, is to actually increase the fitness of a species. So if you don't have variation, natural selection can't take place. It has to be able to select for or against something. So it's all about increasing that fitness. Now, I do want to take a second and just introduce this. This karyotype shows you a couple of things that's going to be helpful when you get into Mendelian genetics. So somatic cells is referring to all of your body cells in the sense that like muscle cell, any other tissue cells that you would have, most of your cells are going to be referred to as somatic. Now, this is referring to humans, and when we talk about this, it's talking about the ploidy, and that 2 in front is representing 2 of each type, okay? And N, that variable for N is standing for the number of types of chromosomes. So when you look at this, if we look at a human cell, it's diploid, 2N. We have 2 of each type, and N is going to be our number of types. So we have 46 chromosomes, and we really have 23 pairs, and that's going to lead into the next thing I got to mention on what are homologous chromosomes. So if you look at this on the right, this whole thing is going to be called, what is this picture called? This is called a karyotype. Basically, it's a snapshot of all the DNA in one nucleus of one human. So think of all the genetic material you have. It's kind of crazy, okay? Now, you need to understand a few things. Let's look at chromosome number 1. Maybe I got this chromosome from mom, maybe this one. Well, not maybe. If this one's from mom, this one's from dad, okay? Now, understanding what this word homologous means, okay? This one I got from mom, this one I got from dad. Now, the shading represents a gene. Now, again, it's not going to look identical to this, but let's say right here, I mean, I know they're homologous because they're going to actually code for the same type of a gene, in the sense that maybe right here, I have no idea if this is accurate or not, but let's just pretend that maybe this region of DNA right here is going to code for eye color. That means that that same gene or that same location on this chromosome would also have to code for eye color, okay? So we can kind of get into the Mendelian genetics that maybe I got the dominant version of that gene, so we'll say big B, from my mom, and maybe my dad, if he had blue eyes, I inherited his chromosome here as being little b. So I got one dominant version of the gene from mom, one recessive version of the gene from my dad. I would be heterozygous for eye color. Okay, so that's what we refer to as being homologous chromosomes. Okay, they're going to have the same genes. Okay, now when we say have the same genes, they don't have to be identical. Like I just showed you, one can be dominant and one can be recessive, but you need to understand what homologous stands for. So maybe over here on the 3rd chromosome, if this is the one I got from my dad, this is the chromosome I got from my mom. Maybe I got the short height from my mom, and maybe I had a dominant version of the gene from my dad for height, so I would be heterozygous here. Maybe I got another version here for, let's say, big H would be brown hair. Big H, both my mom and my dad had that dominant gene. That's what we're looking at, someone to be homozygous dominant. So you need to understand that, especially when we get into genetics. So let's talk about the 46 pairs of chromosomes. Now, if you look here, I have 23 different types. So I have 2 of each type. So if this was a human, like if I asked you what is the ploidy state, a human cell would be 2n equals 46, where I have 2 of each type. My n value would be 23. I have 23 different types, and that's what this karyotype is showing you here. I have 23 types, right? This is your 23rd, this is your sex chromosome. So 2 of each type, I have 23, giving me a total of 46. Now, just to remind you guys, this is in each cell in your body has this, okay? If it's a somatic cell. Now, even your gametes start off as being 2n equals 46. When they do meiosis, that's when they get split. So that's what this next part of the video will be about. But I also want to refer to this real quick. We have 44 autosomes, so meaning chromosomes 1 through 22, male or female, they're all going to be carrying the same amount of genetic information. So the 1 through 22, those are going to be referred to as autosomes, okay? Now this 23rd chromosome, this 23rd pair, that's where it's going to determine your sex, whether you're male or female. So if you're XX, you're female. If you're XY, you're male. So this karyotype is a male. And if you look, it's really interesting. The Y chromosomes are physically shorter than the X chromosome. So that's why us males, we're going to be more prone to having sex-linked traits, because let's say that this one had a color blindness gene, right? Well, females, you could have a dominant version of normal ability to see, but you could be carrying that recessive gene. So males, whatever we get from the mom, like the physical location of that gene is going to be on the X chromosome, where males don't have that counterpart. So not only does it determine your sex, there's a lot of other genes there that are going to be expressed more so in males than females, because males, if we have a gene that's on your X chromosome, we're not necessarily going to be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. It's just whatever we have, we're going to express. Where females, because you would actually have another X chromosome, and you got an X chromosome from your dad, you got an X from your mom, you could actually be heterozygous, homozygous. Males, if we have a gene that we're looking at on our 23rd, it's just what we got, we're going to express, okay? Now that that's out of the way, let's at least kind of introduce chromosomes in terms of kind of what I was just talking about. But don't lose track of what is the point of meiosis. It's to reproduce. So in terms of this, the point of meiosis in this entire chapter, in chapter 13, is all about just reproduction, okay? So it's not, especially when we're getting into sexual reproduction, again, these are going to be your gametes. So it's talking to you about a couple of things here. Meiosis by itself is not really going to do anything for the human population. It's about reproduction. So basically, if a female in her ovaries, she does meiosis, she makes the egg. The male's meiosis makes the sperm. When they fertilize, then it becomes diploid again. So the color coordination here is important. So the haploid represents, remember, you don't have that 2 in front. So that just means this cell only has 1 of each type of chromosome. Same thing for the egg, 1 of each type, but when they fuse together, that's when they become diploid. So 2n equals 46. So that's what we're referring to as haploid. That's when it's 1n. This is just talking about humans. So just understand that these cells were initially diploid, they did meiosis, then they became haploid. The male sperm, out of all the sperm produced, same thing with the female of all the eggs produced, it's completely random on which sperm fertilizes which egg, but then it becomes diploid again. It's that combination. So once those two fuse together, when the sperm from the dad and the egg from the mom, when they fuse together, that's when you get this complete karyotype looking like that. So moving forward, in terms of that, sexual life cycle, this is one thing that I really need to make sure you guys feel okay with, is sexual reproduction happens not just in mammals, it happens in plants. Really weird to think about, but just think of that word sexy plants. It sounds inappropriate, but just remember that plants do sexual reproduction as well. So they do meiosis, they have the haploid, instead of calling it sperm and egg, depending on the type of plant, we're gonna call them spores. They're gonna fuse together and then it becomes the plants. Fungus as well, they're actually gonna be doing sexual reproduction as well. Now, that kind of gets into this weird alternation of generation. So let me show you this. This is showing you like the underside of a fern. It's not something you have to know, but I shouldn't say you have to know specifics, but it's kind of interesting when you think about it. If you look at the actual life cycle of a fern, the leaf part you would see is actually haploid. It's just this right here. These little spores is where meiosis is actually going to be taking place. So inside that, that's where it becomes haploid, and that's where meiosis, well, I should say that's where meiosis takes place, and then they fertilize. So that's where we get into these plants. We have this alternation of generations. So sometimes it's going to be referred to as a gametophyte, where the cells are actually haploid, what you see. Sporophyte is where it actually gets diploid. So interestingly enough, and again, this isn't taken out of your AP exam, but it is important to know that all species, if it can do sexual reproduction, it's not always going to be exactly the same. But the point is, it's all about increasing variance and increasing, really increasing the population. So this is just showing you label, draw, and explain each type. So basically, this is just talking about if we're looking through, we got a mouse here, we got a plant here. Basically, it all stems from that this is meiosis, and this would be fertilization. So this is showing you a plant with the alternation of generations, right? So the green is going to be the gametophyte. And again, you're seeing some part here that the plant you would actually see would be haploid. It's kind of interesting. So, but the point is you're going to do meiosis fertilization. Meiosis, what follows meiosis always is going to be fertilization, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. The next video will be about the actual phases of meiosis.